Hello, everyone, and welcome to the May 2021 Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Journal Club podcast. The Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum, as you know, is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. We believe that it is the responsibility of EMS professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine pre-hospital emergency care. Now, the PCRF promotes research literacy to advance the science of EMS educational research as well. So here with the PCRF Journal Club, we're going to take a closer look at some of the research that's happening in medical education. I'm Megan Corey. I am here with Alex Tremblay and with Katie O'Connor. And maybe joining us in a little bit will be David Page. We're going to be missing Dr. Bill Toon today. Sorry to miss you today, Bill, but we look forward to seeing you back in the future. The study we're going to be reviewing today is development and implementation of a novel web-based gaming application to enhance emergency medical technician knowledge in low and middle income countries. That's a mouthful. This was published as an innovations report. So this was in Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training, which is a global journal of emergency care. This is actually going to be a great discussion today because we're not only going to look just from a research perspective and from an education research perspective, but also from a topical perspective. Things, this is a timely topic in terms of use of innovative technologies and techniques and pedagogies for teaching, in particular because of what we've been all going through as educators and as students over the last year plus. So first, before we do that, and actually this is where I'm supposed to be here. If you are watching our slides, you'll see this is another announcement. We've been making this announcement for a couple months now, and you only have one more month of announcement. And at that point, you're only going to have 1 week until the deadline. So now you've got a little bit of time still. We do have that upcoming call for abstracts. Remember, each year, the call for abstracts highlights the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum's activities. So we get abstracts from all over the world. We get them from EMS providers, from clinicians, educators, administrators, students, all over the nation and abroad. So peer-reviewed process we use to determine which authors, and it's a blinded peer-reviewed process. We determine which authors are going to be invited to present in an oral presentation or poster presentation at a national conference. And typically, there's an international presence often as well. So the call for abstracts for all types, and this is education, clinical, systems abstracts, are all due on the same date, and that is June 30th. 2021. So remember, you can submit your abstract online. And if you want more information about this, you can see this email that's on the screen, and I'll tell you it's pcrf@mednet.ucla.edu. You can email pcrf@mednet.ucla.edu. We'd really like to hear from you. And I think today's study proves that really a lot of you out there as educators already have some data to share. And you could easily start spreading the word and networking with others and producing this kind of data and information that we can then take to the next level, translate to the next level. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And thanks to Katie for streaming us live. Not the techie person here, streaming us live on Facebook. So we're going to begin. We want to remind you, if you're listening out there, that you can use the chat feature on your screen and you can type in the questions and comments. We can bring them into the conversation as we go. If you would like to actually join us on an unmute, you have a longer response or something to contribute based upon your own experience. We're all educators. We'd love to hear from you, especially in this vein, because Alex and I were talking before we came on, and I selected this one for this month not because of we were looking for some rigorous randomized clinical trial that we usually look for all different types of research, and we kind of scan for different things that stand out. And this one stood out to me for a couple of reasons. One is it's an innovations report. And again, given COVID-19 and what we're calling our pandemic pedagogy, I thought this was actually an important topic for us to bring up, and an important one to look at as something that can be done in terms of looking at your own programs and your own data and your own programs and all of the things that you're doing right now to measure. And now we're at the point where we could actually measure some of the outcomes outcomes and some of the feedback from students and put that to an abstract or a piece of research. The other reason was it's novel in terms of the equity and access issue, which we have been talking about on a different scale, on more of our local community scale. This is an equity and access issue on a global scale. So we haven't looked at a whole lot of we've looked at research from other countries, but not that involve multiple, not international kind of research. And this involves low and middle income country, low and middle income countries. So, and the rise of EMS system development and also mobile phone usage, and the two of those happening kind of at the same time merged together in this study. And I thought that was very interesting. And then finally, that just the best practices in teaching. We can talk about some of that today, because just because we're gamifying or technology driven right now because of COVID-19, are we, let's dig at some of the best practices in teaching, things that we know are associated with improved skills and knowledge retention and outcomes for students in general. And then, how do we make sure that that's happening in things like simulation-based learning and tech-enhanced learning, that kind of thing. So let me start first by, let's introduce our couple of panelists here. Or I guess we're all hosts now. We're going to have some regular hosts, which is great. We're having a nice growing group here. So I'm Megan Corey. I'm from the City College of San Francisco. I'm a paramedic program director, and been hosting this podcast with the PCRF, and I'm on the board of advisors of the PCRF. Alex, you want to introduce yourself, where you're coming from?
Yeah, my name's Alex Tremblay. I'm from the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, and I am a quality and education program supervisor for a large public ambulance service. We serve about 10,000 square miles of Minnesota and western Wisconsin with 85 ambulances and 9 helicopters. So that's who I am.
Great, thanks, Alex. And if everybody remembers what Alex presented, it was your graduate research, correct? Yeah, and we had a great discussion on implicit bias in EMS, and that's an ongoing discussion at a national level and international level as well. Katie, can you take a moment and introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Katie O'Connor. I'm the Director of Simulation at the UCLA Center for Pre-Hospital Care.
Yeah, and everybody might remember Katie from the some of the webinars that came out right after COVID-19, when everyone was sort of in a tizzy for a few months about how to scramble and move things to remote instruction, and then how to be creative with instruction. And Katie was one of the early folks who did a webinar, and I know that NEMC's site and on other sites, there's links to webinars, the COA site, links to webinars that were occurring around that time. And there's definitely one where you had shared some of your ideas about using virtual telehealth type virtual simulation to get at clinical decision making and other things like that. So we'll get into that. Let's dig into the study a little bit. So this is, again, an innovations report, and the authors go through a little bit about the background, and essentially what they get at is the low and middle income countries. This is an issue in terms of their morbidity, mortality, of preventable death, preventable illness and injury, and how to get at that problem in some of the low and middle income countries. One of the strategies is to develop EMS. Now, I had a lot of questions about that in my head too when I saw that. Should they make the same mistakes we did and just develop sort of a non-evidence-based kind of EMS system, or the things that can learn from the development in the United States? But that's sort of another approach. But one of the things, so one of the approaches was to develop organized EMS systems, and then within that, how do they, train the providers and keep the training, same issues, keep the training up, keep the continuing education up. At the same time, they noted the rapid rise in mobile phone usage in low and middle income countries. And so putting the two together, they wanted to develop and implement an innovative asynchronous learning tool that was interactive and kind of game-based. So they use the term gamification, and I'm going to actually advance the slide here because this is actually the website that you can go to. It's Emerge Learning I believe. And it's in the article, actually. They link it in the article. And again, one of the things I want to throw out there is we're not here to, we're going to mention a lot of products and different things like that here. This is not a product. This was this is a free tool that has been piloted and used in research. So when there are products out there, when we mention them, we're just mentioning them in the light of from an educator standpoint. We're not promoting anything, and we're just talking about some of the things that we use. So if we do happen to mention them, I'd like you to know that we're not linking ourselves to any particular product. It's more of a practice than anything. So they describe this, how they developed this kind of gamified educational tool. And again, gamification just means that you're using games, meaning a system of rewards and a system of competition, like a leaderboard, and like we're used to with many other things, just regular VR and video games and that kind of thing, in a non-game setting. So this is typically a non-game setting. And then they wanted to look at, this is really more of a feasibility study, because they had participants from multiple countries, and they wanted to really survey them afterwards. So this wasn't an outcome study in terms of learning and everything, although it is a game, so you do get results, and there is a leaderboard and that kind of thing. There were 500. So essentially, they developed this asynchronous learning tool for EMTs. It's web-based, so this is just pieces of the website that you're seeing here. It's web-based, so you need internet access. And that's one of the things I have in my little limitations area. And it's a trivia game. That's what they call it, a trivia game, which is essentially, they're multiple choice questions. So in some ways, you'll first look at this and you say, well, how is this different than other, test prep and other things? But there was some multimedia infused in it. So I haven't seen, all of this. I didn't actually practice with some of it yet, but there's 500 case-based questions. And if anybody has an experience with this particular pilot, piece of technology, let us know. Put it into the chat, or unmute yourself, or ask our organizer to unmute and give us a description. But there were 500 case-based questions. Some were multimedia infused with some scenarios, and then some questions about the videoed snippets of scenarios. And this was piloted with EMS educators from low and middle income countries. And I'll show you the breakdown as we go, because they had tables of demographics in this. So that was how it was done. Now, the design of this, that whole area of the design, I thought that was interesting, except I don't know about you, Alex or Katie, but the area on the technology itself, on how they were able to, because you think about this is multiple countries that they list here, on how they made this able to be used given different limitations. That's a little too techie for me. I'm not sure if either one of you are more technology savvy than I am. And I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. If I want techie, I'll just walk downtown and ask somebody. So there's, that kind of aspect of it was a little above my pay grade and above my head. And then the development of the questions. I don't know if any of that resonated with the two of you as educators, but the development of the questions was done, with not just the standards and blueprinting and validation and link to objectives in mind, but also they did mention that they looked at them across cross-cultural for relevance and appropriateness across cultures. So there was some of that. I don't know how much validation of the questions there was, that actually doing test item analysis afterwards. That might be a next step, to go back and actually itemize and, or look at point by serial and other test item analysis indicators. But that was sort of the development of this. So what did you, Alex, what did you think when you first kind of picked up this study and you started looking at kind of the purpose of it and the breakdown of it?
Well, so from a purpose perspective, I think it's a terrific idea. I think that any way that we can get more content into people's hands, especially at a time when maybe clinical opportunities are limited. You know, thinking of our experience here in the US, not sure about other places, the more information, the better. My biggest two reservations about this in just a really narrow perspective is, one, we don't know how it contributed to the outcome of the student's learning experience, being one part of it. And then the other part of it that I think is interesting is the fact that you have to be online. And I think that that's really good. I mean, I think it's good. They talk about having low latency periods because it's run out of India, which means that they don't have to wait for it to connect to a server in the United States, which is about as
okay. That's what that means.
as technically savvy
You are
as I
totally
am.
techy that I am.
That's the whole of it. But anyway, something like this really has its benefit in, you go to your library. I think of low income communities here in the States. You go to your library, you go to a community center that has internet access, you download all of this information, and then you can deal with it offline, because unfortunately in poorer parts of the United States and in many parts of the world, internet access is something that's not available. We take it for granted. I mean, here we are streaming from our offices, no problem. And so I think it's terrific. And I think that, again, any way we can get more content and testing into people's hands and more educational prospects into people's hands, the better. I'm interested to hear more about what they want to do next.
Yeah. Is this, are we talking about, product development, or are we talking about providing a free service that will be, come out of the government, or, that's actually a really good question. And I don't know if anybody's listening who knows the answers to any of this. That would be a really good question. Maybe the authors don't even know, who knows, but they were developing this, for a purpose. And that was to see, if this innovation would actually, resonate, and would it work for those who would stay in it. And that was sort of one of their problems, was retention. The questions, does come up as you look at this. Again, I mentioned it before, but how is this different from other things? And I think that some of us may use things like Jeopardy and Kahoot and other kind of interactive things that are asking, where you have to create the questions, and there is some type of reward, being on a podium, and cool funny music and confetti and all that kind of stuff, in an interactive area. But I think, again, how many of us have actually looked at what that does, and who is actually benefiting from those? When you look at your podium, is your podium, the same people who are, again, who are we teaching, and who is gaining from it? And some of that comes out of this too, and we can get to that when we get to the results. But that's always going to be the question, and that's the question of equity. I mean, that's trying to make sure that everyone gets what they need is what equity is. And so, is everyone getting what they need? If we can, and I think that the idea behind this is making this accessible, interactive, engaging, will increase the likelihood that we'll get there. But are we doing this? Because that's one thing I do have to say when I do run things like Kahoot, and you have the leaderboard and you see the same people up on the on the podium. How much does that really help the people who are not really going to be on that podium? And does that actually have a detrimental effect on those students? So, yeah, I'm wondering if others have the same.
There are certainly learners who are de-incentivized by seeing the other person win all the time. I mean, I'm not built for sports, and so I stay away from sports. And there are people that maybe aren't built for a trivia environment, and they stay away from it, and that's okay. One of the things I think that, in terms of the ability of a platform like this to be beneficial, is pretty much every ambulance service has an LMS by now. I imagine, at least in the US, a lot of the people that are listening, you have your Ninth Brain or your Saba or whatever particular platform that you're using. What it doesn't allow is for you to track progress of your new and young providers, that maybe, hey, we're gonna send you out a weekly quiz to your phone that's just let's check out on this protocol and see how you're doing, and here's some videos and things. And that's something that I think there's definitely a hole in terms of our ability to keep up on our providers in a urban EMS setting, where we see them for 40 minutes a day, and this rest of the 12 hours they're out running call.
Yeah. Katie, do you have any thoughts on this? You've done a lot of, kind of interactive, innovative teaching.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you guys, but I was like
No, go
sitting
for
in
it.
the background here, like, oh my gosh, I have a thought on that. I have a thought on that.
Jump right
Um,
in.
yeah, so one, just thinking about the equity and access, there's so many things you guys are uncovering and talking about here, from people being um, like not wanting to compete and not having internet access, but there's also a price. So sometimes people have to choose what they pay for as far as how much data they have. And so are they going to pay for this? Or are they going to pay for something else? Or if we're asking them to use an ebook, now they maybe we're limiting their ebook access because they don't have enough data for the ebook plus all of these little things we're doing online. So that's always been a thought. I taught in a fairly rural area of Virginia and literally had students who couldn't download PDFs. They were just too large for their home internet. So they go to McDonald's. So you just had to think about that when we're asking them, like, how much work are we asking them to do if they have to drive somewhere to do this work? And then we used Kahoots in our class, and we would do the live trivia where it was a challenge and it was fast paced. But like Alex was saying, people didn't like that. So we always also had the individual review of it at their own pace. So you could gamify it, you could play it in a large group. We had anonymous usernames, so people often would log in as the instructors, create the instructor names as their usernames. So we'd be having silliness there. But then afterwards, there was a self-paced version. So students could use it as a tool. And those who felt that their questions were getting answered too quickly in the group setting then felt they had enough time to look over it and they weren't missing out. So that's how I tried to manage it. But it's a really difficult thing between gamifying and then actually making it so it's people feel like they're being left out, left behind, or not engaged.
Yeah,
sure.
all these are great points. And let's look at some of the results and see if any of these factors that you're talking about too, that both of you are mentioning, might have come into one of their major issues. The real dominant issue in this is retention, in terms of not retention of knowledge and skills, but retention meaning staying in and and finishing the 12-week program. So completing the actual program, because it actually had elements of what we would consider, the quality training, right? You have the focus on the design and implementation of a learning experience, the focus on the quality of the content, the validity of the content, or the blueprinting of the content at least. Maybe not measuring of validity, but maybe they weren't there yet. And then the engagement of the learner. So focusing on those factors. Those are the factors that we think about in designing a teaching experience, right? Design and implementation of the learning experience, quality of the content, the engagement of the learners as to, no matter what medium you're using, whether it's simulation based or in person or on a, game, those are the kind of qualities that we think of. And then we think of good pedagogical practices, things like retrieval practice, which is what this is, really retrieval practice, interleaving content, which is that case-based and multimedia, code switching, all those kind of things. And then distributed education, so distributing it over 12 weeks rather than having, and this was actually, designing it in weeks like this, I think was probably a good idea too, because you're grouping things, right? You're chunking things into, and you're carrying the user through. So I think the elements were there, and I'm would be surprised if they weren't surprised at the low continuation through the 12-week program. And at some point in the paper, I don't have it in front of me, but at some point in the paper, they talk about the drop-off, how many dropped off after so many weeks, and you could just see the slow, steady decline after a certain amount of time. So right now, what you're seeing is the first part of the demographic and participant characteristics. I'm wondering, Alex and Katie, if you had any thoughts on when you were reading the tables, whether you had any thoughts on things that might have stood out, given the fact that we know the big limitation. They had 252 participants initially from 9 countries, and only 32 participants got through the entire 12 weeks. So we know that's 12.7% retention just to completion is a major factor here. But even just looking at the completers, was there anything? I know there was a few things that stood out for me, and I don't know if that you're thinking the same thing.
Aldous Huxley in Brave New World talks about how people think that the technology that they have is perfect around their age 20 year, and that's why the Model T was so successful in young people. I was a little bit shocked that a majority of the people using the application were over the age of 30, because I imagine that wasn't the target demographic, right? Like,
Yes.
it doesn't really say anything in here, and like, I'm over 30, so I hopefully nobody thinks I'm being mean or anything, but I can't imagine that when they said let's build this web app, they thought let's shoot for zillennials.
Yeah.
I'm actually not surprised based on knowing who built it, right? Like, I feel like it was probably not, like, when I build something, I'm behind. In fact, I just did a Stop the Bleed class and I screwed up the kids' Snapchat. I thought I was videoing for Snapchat, but I turned it off. So like immediately, I think I know how to use Snapchat. So like immediately I'm thinking the people who are building this, and the authors on the paper, potentially that's the issue, right? They're building it for what they know and what applications they use or what they're familiar with. And so we probably are missing the younger market.
That's a much more informed and smarter answer than what I had come up with. So
I was really, really hoping Bill would be here for this part. Because I can just hear him in my head with a lot of comments about, see, I told you, there we are, over 35s. So
well, 12 months is a long time, right? And if you think of the apps that you use now on your phone, I mean, Candy Crush is played in every one of the continents, but it's timed so that you can like play it multiple times a day, and there's new content that's available for you, so, like on a timer basis. So I'm thinking this application didn't have that kind of immediacy that we see. That immediacy is what keeps people current and with it. That payoff.
Gratification, like the automatic gratification of like 20 minutes from now you can play a new level.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, one of the pieces of feedback they had later, in the surveys was that they really wanted, and I don't know about you folks, but I hear this all the time from students when they use test prep programs, or when they want feedback about what they did wrong. They want and not just which ones they got wrong. They want to know the details of why this one was right and this one was wrong. And that was one of the things that came out of the survey was the participants felt that they didn't get enough feedback. That was one of the things they wanted, was the immediate feedback. And I don't know about you, but I know that developing test questions and providing feedback for every response takes a lot of time, of course, but it also means that the integrity of the test question, you have to create this enormous amount of numbers of test questions too, or items, in order to, if you're giving people direct feedback on things, I think people have a question, and maybe that's a false impression that I have, but the idea that if we do this, then we don't have those test questions might go out there, and we worry about collusion and all of that stuff. That may just be a false sense of whatever, that it's not real, that it's not a real concern. So then we saw the pretty even in terms of the percentages of male to female. So it's not like you saw more male competition. We always think of in kind of a stereotypical way as a male thing. You didn't really see that in there. Very few completers, but they still no patterns in that as well. So moving on to the next table then, this was the characteristics based upon the profession, the length of employment, and the highest education. There's definitely a few things that stood out for me here. What about you?
Having now had a little bit of experience with doing my own research, with getting up to a couple, 3-4 studies, that people with postgraduate education again overrepresent the population, which seems to be common in completed studies, right? So people that have spent a lot of time learning about research tend to do the research work.
It also matches with the age range, right? So these were older people that completed, and they tend to have more longer length of employment. So to me, it seemed like the age of completion was driving some of these other factors, or maybe the other way. Like, not sure which one's the cause and effect, but they seem to correlate well.
Yeah, that's
That was
definitely.
actually a concern, I think, for me was not the age, not the profession. And actually, in the profession, you see, 18 out of the 32 are EMTs or paramedics, and 6 didn't answer. So, and we had a few others in here, but really we're hovering around the traditional role in EMS. Um, the greater than 8 years, kind of like you said, goes with the age group. But the concern to me was the last one, the highest education. So I'm glad you brought that up, Alex. That was my area that I starred here. That wow, maybe we're, I know this. We've got low retention, but look who we're retaining. We're retaining the ones with, although look at the total participants too. The majority of them have a university or postgraduate degree. So that I thought that was interesting too. Does that say something about who we're calling to the table for EMS in low and middle income countries as well? So, or who gets to the table for EMS, or does it say something about the way that the education is structured in EMS? I'm not sure what that speaks to.
I wonder too if one of the things that I think is challenging, and maybe this is just a simplified table, but not all of these places have EMTs and paramedics as we define EMTs and paramedics in the United States, right? And may also have different types of training programs, like a university degree. In our minds probably makes people think bachelor's, etc. But there are a lot of completed college programs that are degree awarding. Most paramedics in the United States have either a certificate or an associate's right now. So that I wonder if maybe some of these buckets are a little narrower than they're meant to be.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. But if it does represent, the degree holders, then this being kind of a global equity question, that brings to mind, who is coming to the table? Is this and we know that equity pedagogy is engaging pedagogy. So really curious about more about the demographics of this and of the folks that are making up the EMS population as well. So
I
this
do
is
think
the, oh,
missing some
sorry, go
of
ahead.
the, well, just we talked about it earlier, but we're missing those lower income and potentially lower education levels when we do things with mobile phones and Wi-Fi in areas, or needing data in areas that can be difficult to access that.
Yeah, that's a good point, because even though we talk about the rise of mobile phone usage in this low and middle income country group, which I'm going to actually advance the slide here so you can see which countries we're actually talking about here. Might be a little bit blurry here. So these are the participating countries, and the vast majority were in India. But then you see other representation here: Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines, United Arab Emirates, the US, Botswana, South Africa, and then not answered. So that was an interesting one. So these were the folks that came to the table and those that completed, and the majority fall into India here. So yeah, that does raise the question of when it comes to this mobile phone usage, are we still talking about those, is this an economic, a socioeconomic issue as well? Access to mobile phones, is that, a part of this? Is that an important element of being able to access that and internet as well? Okay, let me look at this. So this is the survey outcome. So they use this this again was a pilot study. The 32 participants completed it over 12 weeks, and then they turned to survey the 32 participants who all responded. So every one of them responded. However, they wanted to interview also, or sorry, survey the non-participants. And of the non-participants, of the 250 some odd non-participants, only 4 of them answered. It would have been nice to actually have heard from the more of the non-participants. So as to why they didn't participate, why they didn't continue, time, money, what was the issue with their non-participation. So here's the outcome of the survey: 12.7% retention to completion. We saw in terms of their overall positive reviews on, you know, whether it was easy to use, whether they felt that it improved their knowledge and felt that they were better prepared for their job. All of them reported in the, you know, most likely categories, in the upper categories. The primary motivators of doing this, of participating in this, the first one was to improve patient care, then recognition on the leaderboard. So thought that was interesting. I want recognition on the leaderboard. And then all of them said they would recommend, or they would repeat it, or they would recommend it to others. So oh, whoops, it says screen sharing is now paused. Did I press something? Move this window away. Okay, hopefully that's still going. Okay, so anything, you know, in terms of the survey, if you were to do this, if you were the researchers on this, what would you want to know next? So you have these results, you have this low retention, where would you go from here?
I think, Megan, you kind of hit the nail on the head. You have to go back to the people that didn't finish and ask why, right? So and KT is like the expert here, and I just drive ambulance, right? So the thing that's really fascinating or most interesting to me is, what are people giving up in exchange for doing this? You know, are people able to, who have better access to internet, more likely to do this? And is that the question? Is it was 12 weeks, and 12 weeks is a long time for the people that EMS classically attracts worldwide, are people that want to go out and do the work. That's step one, is what's the process from there.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg has a question too about the information on if they're reminding people to play the game and app-based. Again, that's like something that Candy Crush does. One of the like more famous apps is they'll send you a push notification that you have more lives. So like a reminder to play, reminder to keep going, or you get points for logging in each day. And that's really common with a lot of these apps that are monetarily driven, but incentive on the leaderboard or prizes or something for logging in and keeping the streak. I don't know, Megan, do you know if they had those features in this game?
Yeah, they talked about in the section on reflective discussion, they talked about the weekly communication during, oh, that was just during the game development, but they did talk about, frequent ongoing communication with participants via email was important to encourage engagement. And then it said, given the attrition rate and suggestions from the users, future iterations will incorporate more popular messaging platforms. So they talked more about platforms, using more platforms, but it may just be that the message itself for frequent messaging. Maybe they felt that they couldn't reach some of the ones who didn't complete. Maybe there was some type of you know, feeling that there was a disconnect in terms of the communication. But they talked about trying to be interactive and have ongoing communication via email. So that may be the issue too, by having it via email.
Yeah, I think email is probably becoming a less easy to access or less responsive way of communicating. It's almost like it's taken the point of mail now, and texting or app-based messaging with push notifications seems to be a faster response. So it, like we were saying earlier, it's an older group that finished. An older group is probably using email communication too. When you're thinking of the younger people, I know like WhatsApp and those types of communication are just more prevalent in that group.
And that's funny because they mention WhatsApp in here. They mentioned using more popular messaging platforms such as WhatsApp in the messaging.
In the screen grab that you have up, it has two separate links to WhatsApp. The screen grab that you put up earlier of the login screen, and that's totally like a great point. KT is you know, we, from an education perspective, especially continuing education perspective, we've got policies that say we have to notify you by email because then it's an official corporate communication. And again, I imagine, like, from a guy with a public policy background, I imagine there's a lot of organizations that use that area of public policy. And so finding ways to connect with non-traditional learners has got to be something that I think we have to be really proactive about, especially as you know, dwindling registration in EMS programs and things of that nature.
That's a really
Well,
good point.
yeah, I was gonna say the security concerns too sometimes outweigh the ability to communicate. I know for us, we have a lot of firefighters that come through UCLA that use their personal email for school because they can't get to their restricted government emails without going through ridiculous security. I have to
Mhm.
do a duo notification just to get to my UCLA email. So it's like, it's making it harder to communicate when we try to communicate officially. But then, UCLA was just in the news for a huge data breach. So what, like, do people want to participate in these apps and give us their data if we're gonna then like sell it on the dark web? So it's hard.
Yeah. The issue of access to mobile phones, though, what is your sense in terms of the ability to have a smartphone these days? Because I know that let's talk about just colleges in general. All applications are online. There's no paper applications anymore. Everything has been made for a mobile platform, and so that it's easy to use a mobile phone. The not just the applications, but the even the learning management systems are made for mobile phones so that students can actually operate their learning management system on a mobile phone. And actually, even during COVID, when we returned to campus, and I'm sure everyone's had this experience, how could you get in? You had to scan the QR code and complete the survey. And we had it in multiple languages, but it was still a QR code, and you still required a mobile phone. I believe they had alternate paper versions, but I know we never used them at our campus, and we have a pretty big mix of students from all different income levels, and languages. So it seems like and I'm not sure the data on how many of our students will have access to mobile phones and do have those opportunities too. So to the earlier point about access to mobile phones, what is the reality behind that? Anybody have any sense of that?
I think for me, my experience has been everyone has access to it. It's again the like amount of bandwidth has always been the issue, not the device itself.
Mhm.
But then strangely, and this may just be a fire service culture or maybe just like anecdotal experience, um, at the hospital when they're on clinical shifts, I would love for them to participate in an app like this to just be doing studying, but there's a lot of feedback from the students that nurses are going to get mad at them if they're on their phones or they have their
Mhm.
devices, even just to
Yeah.
input like PhysApp data. And I mean, our clinical coordinator had that. He was like, it's unprofessional for them to have their devices out. And I'm like, no, it's totally professional. They're logging their hours. Like they have to log their contacts. But there's again a notion of like the people who are in, maybe they're older, and maybe that's me being a stereotype here, but that perspective of like, you have your phone out, you must be playing Candy Crush. No, I'm playing EMS questions to get better at patient care. Like, how do we change that dynamic?
I think too, like, I think the time has to come here where students are going to have to be connected all the time. I mean, my first session here, we talked about having a roving clinical coordinator who took data in Australia, right? That was my first time on the show, and the importance. Just a quick update: per the Pew Research Center in the United States, 76% of Americans who make less than $30,000 annually have a smartphone. At 83% if you're under 50,000 and 85% if you're 50,000 plus. So, and in rural America, it's just 80% of people have a smartphone, not a cell phone. This is just smart devices that have the capability of accessing the internet. So, I think, and that's in the United States, right? I think when we talk about the things that we do in the U.S., we take for granted those things. Like my phone's right here. I'm looking at WhatsApp to see if Haley or
Yeah.
somebody else tells us what the questions are. So and Greg, I assume
Yeah.
that's Greg Fries, makes a very valid point that we have to compete for the attention of other things on a phone. And I wonder if doing something like this is your iPad, this is your dozer pad from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, the only things you can do on it are school related things, including studying and using this testing app, might have a better benefit. And maybe that's a future implication for this type of thing.
You mean lockdowns?
Yeah, that you can get on FizzApp, PubMed, and like this testing site. That's it, you know.
That's a really good point that Greg makes, because we're not only doing that on phones, we're competing for that on the computer, we're competing for that in the classroom, we're competing for that in everything. But it's much more, you know, just like Greg is mentioning, it's much more immediate. It's that instant gratification kind of competition, and we're actually competing again with all of these other things, Facebook. And I mean, and that's not just a generational thing too, because I find myself doing that when I'm, you know, sailing through a bunch of boring emails, and now I've got, you know, the other tab to click open and I can go somewhere else. And, you know, I'm not one of those people that has 75 tabs open, but I do commonly have, you know, more than 5 open and popping
feeling a little
between
called
them.
out right now. I have like 16 windows with probably 75 tabs open.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're competing for that just in general, and I think one of the things too about the mobile phone usage and the bandwidth and everything is another thing that comes with COVID as well, which is the environment, just the environment in general. So even if you have the device, the bandwidth, the Wi-Fi hotspot, during COVID, we found that people were commonly, you know, either at a house where they had kids and, you know, lots of family members. Maybe they were a first generation college student and nobody in the house really understands what it means to be, they didn't have a quiet space to do this. So commonly you would see people in their cars sometimes doing, or outside of a Starbucks or something, trying to, or a public building, trying to latch on to a, you know, somebody's public Wi-Fi so that they could do their class. I actually had this discussion early on with another faculty who was saying, well, you know, everyone must be on camera and must be there at this time and must be. And I said, you know, this person, I think, lives out of their car right now. And that's why you see the car. They're not actually, you know, trying to multitask. They're trying to go to class. So yeah, there's some of that too. So even if you have the device, the bandwidth, the ability to use it, there's all of those other things around. And that's what we've talked about a lot here lately. And that's the whole equity issue as well, is what, you know, are we able to recognize that as educators, to realize that people have these multiple perspectives, multiple environments, and even if they have the devices and the access, do they have the time and do they have the environment?
And I think,
Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
no, please, KT, please.
I was just talking to Dr. Davis. She's doing assessment at the medical school now, and they got feedback on one of their programs too from some of the students that it wasn't hitting at all the right learning levels, and they, like, the kids who weren't at that level felt discouraged and that they needed to go home and study on their own and they couldn't ask questions. So I'm thinking too, I mean, like you mentioned earlier, it's hard to make these many questions, but if we're not gauging the right level of questions for the right people, they can become disengaged, either because the questions are too easy and they feel like they're not getting anything from it, or if you got every single question wrong the first time you logged into this, would that make you want to complete it for 12 weeks?
Right. Like, this is way above the education standard of where I am, you know.
That would have been a really interesting piece of data to know, was performance associated with whether they stuck with it. You know, what things were associated with it. Now, it's, again, hard to determine because you had so many who didn't in this, but all kinds of great questions out of this.
One of the things too, you talked about people who are, you know, potentially living out of their cars while they're in paramedic school, and people with different socioeconomic backgrounds. Those are the people that we have to attract to this business over time to be successful and to be representative of our communities. And maybe that's just my soapbox, but we have to have this opportunity to make EMS represent the communities that they service. And so we have to find ways to get creative to deliver content. So kudos to this group for developing something, and I think that they've laid the foundation for something even larger than just this in the future, and that's what research has to be, is foundational. Tim writes in, sorry Tim, that he had received a complaint about a student using their phone to enter FISDAP data, and that the students need to remind people what they're doing on their devices. We get complaints as an ambulance service, a lot of our staff being on their phones, but our protocols are digital only now. And they're on an app on your phone, and they're on an app on the tablet. And because people are so attached to their smart devices, we found a lot better protocol compliance. But it's the same thing. You have to remind the patient or the customer that, hey, I'm looking at the protocols to make sure I treat you appropriately in the next step, or get this dose right. And the same thing here.
Yeah, very true. They also mentioned here about some of the steps that they would like to take, which is something we were just talking about. And they said key steps are to translate content into additional languages and provide detailed answer explanations. So they do want to provide those explanations in here, and they do want to look at additional languages. So language access is another thing. All of these things about. I think of what kind of competencies can be added to our traditional list of competencies, when we run a simulation, like, did you explain to the patient, the procedure? How about, did you explain to the patient the reason that you have your phone out? When you're looking up your protocol, it's sort of part of that affective, were you professional on the scene, and did you explain, the procedure and what you were doing to the patient. Language access, though, comes up too, because there are commonly apps that are used now for interpretation services, whether it's, it doesn't matter whether it's sign language or in any other language. If you have there's some, I know hospitals and ambulance provider agencies will contract with interpreter services where you can get a visual interpreter, because there's so much in communication that is nonverbal as well as verbal, and that you can actually get a person on a screen. And I've seen that. I don't know if anyone has used that on ambulances, but I know in hospitals you commonly see that, where they can get a person on a screen, typically on a tablet, iPad or a tablet, and access the language. They can even, a lot of the interpreter services can also determine which language it is if you're not sure which one it is. And then actually, again, the value of this is beyond the semantics, the vocabulary, the words. So we always think in EMS education and in EMS and maybe in medicine in general, that it's about the vocabulary. Do I have a working vocabulary of this language? And it's really so much more. It goes into language, as we know, and so the use of qualified interpreters comes into mind in terms of how to do that in an emergency setting, and using devices like this. So just something to think about, add on to this.
Such a good point. I once treated a patient for a good deal for chest pain, but she actually had a broken heart. But my level of Spanish understanding was a little off there. So that's just it. The problem I see, though, is that we're still doing EMS education in a very narrow focus of you have to have this memorized. I was literally just talking to an educator who's like, we don't do open book testing for ACLS because they need to have it memorized. And I get where people are coming from, but it's almost like the thing in medical education where you have to do a 96-hour shift as an intern because that's what I did. Why are we eating our young? We don't, yeah. I mean, look at national registry testing. We don't have a system to let them use electronic resources. We're not teaching them how to use job aids. We won't even let them use a calculator for med doses when we know that it's better for the patients. What are we doing? Why are we testing without using job aids? Why are we testing without using electronic resources? We're setting the students up to make mistakes. It's just not a good system.
Yeah, decades of tradition unimpeded by progress, right?
So true. That's like an entire show. What you're bringing up here is like an entire show. So I'm going to kind of search the literature for a few things that can relate to that topic. We've actually raised that issue before. The specific example you use is probably very familiar to a lot of educators out there, where you have an instructor that comes and says, we are not doing this open resource thing. And open resource testing really depends upon how you are designing your test as well. If you're designing a very rigorous, validated, scenario-based test that promotes critical thinking and clinical reasoning, and you have an hour to complete these, so many questions, and the test opens and closes, and you can use all of your resources, that's probably more likely to mimic a clinical setting than anything else. Because you're retrieving information from resources that you need to use right away, which you should be doing to double check. It promotes a culture of safety if you're double checking something rather than, you know, relying on archaic ways of calculating and doing things, you know, to try and get something right, crossing your fingers, isolated somewhere. So yeah, I completely agree with you that this and this, you know, I'm hearing Pat Tritt in my head, I'm hearing Kim McKenna in my head. There are a few things too that we have to remember that with respect to, you know, Pat, who always talks about, you know, when we talk about simulation based education, it's not just somebody walking in and picking their last cool call and saying, can you handle this? This is something that is, you know, the fidelity of a simulation is not whether the mannequin is a high fidelity simulator. It's the fidelity of the simulation itself, whether or not it's, you know, blueprinted and validated, and whether or not you have the outcomes that you want to see ahead of time before you run the simulation, and are all the things that matter embedded into the simulation. And then Kim always talks about reflection, the importance of reflection. And you know, I think we were on something recently together where she reminded me about, I was actually on one of these shows, I think, of that John Dewey quote about experience without reflection is just experience, and experience with reflection is learning. So and I just think that's such a great quote, such a Kim McKenna quote, even though it's from John Dewey. But it, you know, that comes with this too. Just simply testing is not enough and getting a score, but it's also reflecting on your learning that causes that behavior change as well.
Yeah, like it would be great if we could develop an app like they did here where the students or people inputted why they picked the wrong answer. So we could maybe see if there's a trend there too. From like an educator standpoint, Jenny Rudolph at Harvard CMS always says you have to go from WTF to WTF. Like when you're like, why the heck did they pick that, to what was their frame? Why were they thinking that? Yeah. And that's I think that piece that's always missing when we do these like multiple choice questions quickly without that information. We're not telling the students why the answer is right. They're not telling us why they chose the wrong answer. And we're missing that learning and reflection that could really engage people more in these kinds of multiple choice things.
It adds such a nuance too to test validation. So instead of just looking at item analysis and statistics and seeing point by serials and saying, well, this one isn't selecting between the high scorers and the low scorers, you know, there could be other factors at play. And again, these could be preconceived notions, they could be cultural barriers, they could be other things. So by asking that, getting that qualitative research, that qualitative piece of why did you answer it this way, you know, not only gets at knowledge gaps and areas for study, but it might also get at, wow, this is actually a problematic question, or one that actually isn't taking into account that this, you know, something isn't correct in this question in terms of the way we framed it. Okay, it looks like we are getting close. I don't think we have too many. We're getting close to the top of the hour here. So any comments going forward in terms of how you might, you know, think about this kind of research? And actually, let me ask you a question. So the one thing again that we started with in talking about this study is how doable this can be on a smaller scale at your own institution, where you're using all kinds of innovative strategies right now during COVID. What steps could you take, or maybe would you take, to contribute to a body of educational literature? Where can we connect these so that we can not just return to the same old thing, right? We don't want to return, we want to move forward. So where can we go from here, and how can we contribute to that?
I think from a organizational perspective, from a patient-facing organizational perspective, finding a way to link live quizzing or gamifying to protocol compliance through a quality management system. Now, granted, that's my background. So if we talk about making sure that every adult gets 0.5 of epi instead of 0.3, does that change our clinical outcomes over time, or does that change our protocol compliance over time? Would be something I'd be interested to see.
Mm-hmm. Katie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think to me, it's like having the device and having the job aid available. And I think of how they engaged patients in hand washing in clinical settings, and they got patients to like really be like, hey, go ahead and tell your doctor to use their to hand wash. If we could somehow change the narrative there, where we do some kind of satisfaction survey, or we get some information when the providers are saying, hey, I'm checking the protocols here, I'm double checking the dose, and that would be kind of interesting. I think we're a long way from that, but if we have job aids like we have hand washing, that would be something that I would be interested in seeing.
Great. So the next time will be in June. We'll be back here in June, so we'll continue discussion. We'll be picking another article for you to discuss. We're at the top of the hour here, so we want to thank everybody for joining us and congratulate the researchers on just promoting education research, getting it out there. Certainly you might have something in your program, whether it's from quality improvement data or from your education data that you're collecting, you know, as part of accreditation or as part of your, you know, your college itself. You probably have program review data and all kinds of data that you have to collect. Maybe you'd like to compile that and share that with us. Share some of your experiences that you've gone through during COVID-19 in terms of innovating in your practice. And let's pull together and see if we can improve practices and address those access and equity issues for our students and for our patients. So thank you all for joining us. This is Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum. Thanks to FSDAP for sponsoring this. And we will be back on June 25th at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central. The next PCRF clinical podcast, though, will be Monday, June 14th, again, 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central. So thanks, everyone. If you'd like to present an upcoming article, or if you have suggestions for an article that you'd like to see reviewed, please email David Page at dpage@emsed.net. Thank you all. Bye.